the beginning of Chapter 7, The Violence of Party Politics. I'm going to start on this first video to wind up George Washington's presidency and George Washington himself, and then most of the rest will continue with Alexander Hamilton and then John Adams. So, we have finished the Constitution. We have a new government. Thank goodness we have a man who is 100% trustworthy because he does not seek power, who is unanimously one of the only two presidents elected unanimously as president in 1789, the year the French Revolution starts. George Washington is 57 years old. He is not a young man. He would dearly love to go back to his farm, but he has to wait another 8 years for that. For the first year of his presidency, really, George Washington and James Madison are pretty much the entire federal government. There are 100 congressmen. There are 30 people who work for the Treasury, keeping the finances and the books, and about 75 post office employees. We have an army of, no kidding, 700 men for 4 million people. The annual budget was about $5 million. Oregon today, one of our smaller states, has about 5 million people and 80,000 government employees. So we are running the United States government during George Washington's 2 terms with about maybe 150, 200 guys. And George Washington is doing a lot of this. George Washington is a Federalist, and we will talk about this in a minute, but Federalist, strong federal government because of his war experience trying to get help for the American army with a weak central government. What he learned is you need a strong central government to run a country, but very carefully. You have to be careful with it. He does not trust the average man. I'm quoting George Washington. Mankind is better left to themselves, and left to themselves, they are unfit to govern themselves. So he always saw America as a whole rather than separate states, rather than being a Virginian or a New Yorker or anything else. He was accused at the time of being a monarchist. He was not, of course, at all. He was also accused of being a spy, particularly after Jay's Treaty. But he was none of these things. He did, on the other hand, as president, order a gold coach, which I think is interesting because he thought the president should be a respected office and people should look up to them. So I usually try to do one event in each presidency. We have Citizen Genet, who was basically a French spy who Washington tosses out of the country. We have Jay's Treaty, which was supposed to solve our trade issues, which did nothing to solve our trade issues. So I'm just ignoring those two. I will not ask you about them. But I do want to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. This is the one big event in George Washington's presidency. 1794. This is a direct result of Alexander Hamilton's economic plans, which I will talk about in a minute. But he began to tax alcohol. This is not a good thing to do in America because we were a nation of pretty free and heavy drinkers at the time. So Alexander Hamilton is trying to get more tax revenue in besides just taxing imports, and he puts a fairly high tax on whiskey. And he could have gotten away with it if he had thought it out a little bit more. But he is taxing not the consumption of whiskey, not taxing a drink in a bar, but the production of whiskey. And it's a pretty serious tax. It was a 25% tax. So this is not, 2% that he can get away with. The tax, in addition, had to be paid in coin, not the paper money that was still floating around, but in gold or silver. So he was taxing the size of the still that you were making your whiskey in and the production of whiskey. He's taxing the whiskey you are making at home for yourself. And I would estimate probably 2/3 of the farmers in America had whiskey stills in their barns because they have way too much corn, and the only way to get corn to market is to condense it and distill it into whiskey, besides the fact that they're drinking a lot. The whiskey taxes were supposed to pay off the debts for the Revolution, not to build roads, not to help fight Indian problems. So Westerners who are paying these are getting nothing back from them. They don't see any tangible results for their taxes. Does any of this sound familiar? The immediate response, of course, is that particularly in the West, And particularly in Pennsylvania, people are furious about the whiskey tax. And we are starting with slides 23 to 25 here, sorry. The response, particularly around Pittsburgh, which was a booming frontier town, they sent petitions to Congress. There were protest meetings going on. One congressman from Pennsylvania got up in Congress and said, and I am quoting, "My constituents have long been in the habit of getting drunk in defiance of all the duties and taxes Congress is wicked enough to impose upon them, and they will continue to get drunk." So there, federal government. This is an issue because how big should the federal government be? If you give them more taxing powers, the government will increase in size. And a lot of people, after a revolt against England, are against this. So there is a revolt in the West. They were tarring and feathering, as you can see in that second slide, some of the tax collectors. It's almost impossible to enforce this. You have to track down the stills, go on people's properties. Not a good plan at all. And there was way, way too many whiskey distilling stills. So no money is being collected. There is a revolt against the federal government. Okay, George Washington, what are you going to do about it? We are no longer under the Articles of Confederation. We are now under the Constitution. So George Washington, as president, with Alexander Hamilton as his second in command here, calls up 15,000 militiamen from New Jersey, Virginia, and Maryland. George Washington has been our only president to actually lead troops in the field. And this he did before during the war, of course, when he wasn't president, but also as president, because George Washington, they find a white horse for him, of course, he's George Washington. And behind him, you will see riding a guy on a brown horse, that's Alexander Hamilton. So the two of them lead 15,000 militia called up from different states. Now, who is going to be called up in the militia? People who are not otherwise running businesses or farms. So you have some urban poor, you have the unemployed. This is not exactly your grade A soldier. Again, the nickname of the civilians along the way was George Washington's Watermelon Army, because they had to stop every 2 hours and have watermelon breaks on their march. They march on Pennsylvania, they march west to put down the revolt against the federal government, against the federal law to tax whiskey stills. Pioneers in the West, of course, here, oh my God, there's 15,000 men coming, and George Washington is coming. All they have to hear is George Washington, because he, of course, is a legend in his own time, and the whole thing dissolves immediately. Amnesty to most of the leaders. They actually arrested 20 people. They were almost immediately pardoned. Only 2 were convicted and jailed for short periods. George Washington pardoned everybody involved. So the Whiskey Rebellion dies down, but the long-term effect of it is, of course, that the Republican Party, the non-Federalists, gain huge support from this, because you are sending 15,000 men to put down a rebellion among a bunch of farmers, which everybody identifies because 95% are small farmers. This is way, way government overkill, according to many Republicans. And the Republican Party immediately gets a lot of support from it. There were, we estimate, over 2,000 whiskey distillers just in Kentucky. And their issue was, can you tax Kentucky distillers because they're not even a state yet? A lot of conspiracy, a lot of paranoia, large federal government, large armies were worried about this right after the Revolution. What are you going to do about it? The other immediate effect of this was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These were written secretly, without their names on it, by Madison and Jefferson, who were very concerned about the huge overreaction to a bunch of farmers trying to distill whiskey in their barns, about large federal government control. They write and publish 2 sets of resolutions. They are important not at the time, but for later on. Madison, being much more judicious in his political theory, suggested that the federal government has power, but should balance its power with the states. Thomas Jefferson, being much more of an idealist and much less pragmatic and practical, suggests that when the states joined the U.S. government, the new federal government, they did not give up a lot of their power to the federal government. They kept a lot of their powers. Madison suggests that they gave up most of their powers. So Thomas Jefferson says this is a contract, states between federal government, but they did not give up all of their rights. This is used later on, of course, about 60 years later, in the prelude to the Civil War, because this is the argument the Confederate States used, that the U.S. government is a contract. If we don't like what the government is doing, we will withdraw our permission. So it has long-term repercussions. The immediate repercussion is the Republicans gained political power. So George Washington, finally after his second term, they cannot convince him to be king for life of America, goes home. He retires to his beloved farm. And the King of England is totally amazed that he would actually give up power. He rides around his farm, and I mentioned the fact he's constantly inundated with guests. Over 1 year, he had close to 1,000 guests, and guests come and stay for several weeks at a time. He's a very interesting farmer. He was very progressive. He was trying to switch to grain crops. He was involved with experimenting with different methods of fertilizing his fields. And at the age of 67, he gets strep throat. He is bled out of 5 pints of blood and dies in December of 1799. So the book kind of closes on the era of George Washington. From the beginning of the Revolution till 1800, he is the key figure in American history. So we need to move on to, slide number 16, which is Republicans versus Federalists. This is the major conflict that occurs immediately once George Washington is president. Nobody's going to argue with George Washington. He's like a god. But in his cabinet, he has Alexander Hamilton, who is the Secretary of the Treasury. His vice president is John Adams, and his Secretary of State, Foreign Affairs guy, is Thomas Jefferson. And immediately, once the threat of the British is gone and we have solved that, we begin to get internal splits. People begin squabbling among themselves, not surprisingly. We have a government, and since the Constitution is vague, the argument becomes, what exactly does the Constitution mean? How much power does it give the federal government? We are still discussing that issue in America today because the Constitution does not spell everything out. So on one side, you have the Federalists. George Washington absolutely is a Federalist, but the leaders are John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And on the other side, you have Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And the argument becomes, what should the federal government be responsible for? And it all goes back to that Puritan issue of what you believe about human beings. If people are, let's start with the Republican side, if people are generally good by nature, will do the right thing, if you have confidence in the public, then they do not need a whole lot of laws and regulations. Left alone, people will do the right thing on their own. You do not need a strong federal government because people are going to do the right thing anyway. Coincidentally, the Republicans were closely allied with the French. The French were our allies in the Revolution. They see the ideal America as a nation of small farmers, which is exactly what was outside their window, 95% small farmers. They mistrust the wealthy. They don't like the concentration of wealth. They are anti-industry to some degree because they saw what happened in England and France with the Industrial Revolution, and the mass of men working in factories were completely downtrodden and poverty-stricken. They want a nation of small farmers where everybody can be independent and own their small farms. The other side, the Federalists, are exactly what they sound like. They believe in a strong federal government, Hamilton and Adams. They do not trust the public. They do not trust people to do the right thing left on their own. If you believe that, then a strong government with lots of laws and regulations is necessary to guide people to do the right things. They are pro-British. They see the British government as their model. And they are pro-industry because they see that the wealth that industry has brought France and England. So they, in many ways, are the flip side. Alexander Hamilton talked about the government of the well-born and the wealthy. Thomas Jefferson would have turned pale at that expression because he believed in the rights of the common man. So you have two dramatically opposing views here of federal government because the Constitution is vague. It does not lay out exactly what the federal government should do. And then we have the leader, one of the leaders of the Federalist Party, starting with slide 18 and 19, Alexander Hamilton. And let me do his biography first. I spend a lot of time on these founding fathers because these are the guys that put the country together that we recognize today. Alexander Hamilton is a fascinating character in American history. He's a mixed bag like all of these guys. There's good and bad there. The short list of his accomplishments as a very young man. He made the U.S. government have a sound credit rating when we were totally bankrupt. He made it equal to European nations. He moved the presidency from a passive to an active role in policy making. He organized the entire economic program single-handedly with a national bank, with a debt system, with a taxing system. He also organized on the side a customs service and the Coast Guard in his spare time. He served in the American Revolution as a soldier starting at age 17, and for 30 years afterwards, he is a key figure and devotes his entire time and energy to the U.S. government and to the success of the revolution. He is also our first rags to riches story, except for Ben Franklin, of course, and our first sex scandal in American history. He's a very rare character, a great thinker, and a great man of action. Washington, great man of action, great man of character, but not a great intellect. He would be the first to say this. On the other hand, Hamilton, like all of them, have some real serious quirks. Thomas Jefferson, his sworn enemy, says of Hamilton openly, without anyone else, without numbers, he is a host unto himself. He is in himself an entire powerhouse. And his biography is very, very interesting. He's born 1755 on a tiny island in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, wall-to-wall sugar plantations. His father is the younger of 9 sons of a Scottish lord in Scotland. The others all went to university, all had very distinguished careers, but his father, James, clearly was the black sheep of the family, clearly lacked any kind of ambition, organization. We don't know too much about him. Not much has been written about him. But he shows up on this Caribbean sugar island, we assume with some money to make his fortune. He doesn't do that. He ends up totally bankrupt. And he starts shacking up with a woman who had married previously a man 12 years older than himself. At the age of 16, she had a son with this guy, had a terrible marriage, runs off, the son died, and she meets this younger son of a Scottish lord, James. Shacks up with him, and with him she has 2 sons. She was never legally divorced from her first husband, so technically the 2 children are bastards. Alexander and his younger brother are illegitimate children. So it was quite right when John Adams, who hated his guts, called him later the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler, but not to his face, of course. You can see from the photograph there, the portrait, he's quite a handsome fellow. Reddish brown hair, not terribly tall, about 5'8", blue eyes, sandy, reddish brown hair, and we know he is Scotch, so we know the ancestry. We know his father was Scottish. So when the kid is about 10, father runs off, deserts the family, just disappears. At the age of 12, the mother dies in a fever. The little bit they had, she was running a store to support herself and the sons. So they're left almost destitute, these two little boys, 12 and 10. They are given into the custody of a cousin who shortly thereafter commits suicide. So they are orphaned again. Then they are taken in by another aunt and uncle who live on the island. Those people die in a fever as well. So they go through 3 sets of parents or surrogate parents and are left destitute each time. The brother was eventually apprenticed to a carpenter. He kind of disappears. He clearly was no great genius. Alexander Hamilton, with very little education, a couple of years, he could basically read and write, is taken in by the owner of a British trading company. And he gives him room and board, and he says, okay, you're basically literate. That's a rare quality on a slave island. You're going to keep my books. And from the beginning, Hamilton had a knack for numbers and figures and mathematics. So he begins to keep the books for this export company. They're exporting sugar and importing other things they need. He tracks the cargo. He buys and sells stuff. He pretty much takes over the office and does it very competently at the age of 13 or 14 or so. What he learned on that sugar island was, number one, he really did not like wealthy people, although his patron is a fairly wealthy man. He liked that guy, but not the wealthy. And he really learned to hate slavery because he saw it all around him and the abuse of slavery on this sugar island. The company owner sees the kid is fairly brilliant, on his own money, sends him to New York City to get a college education at King's College, which was one of the few colleges in America. King's College still exists today in New York City. When we became independent from Britain, of course, we changed the name. We can't have no King's College here, and they changed it to Columbia University. It's still there, and there are 2 statues of Alexander Hamilton on campus today that you can go see if you walk around. So he shows up. He's like 14, 15 years old, and one sign of his genius, he completes his college education in 1 year. And you all know how difficult that is. Now, I have to say at the time, college education was considered to be 3 years, not 4. But Hamilton does it in 1 year. He's clearly genius intellect. At the age of 17, the revolution comes along. He had a few courses to finish. He actually never finished a college degree because the revolution came along. He immediately dropped out and begins to work for the revolutionary cause. So he never quite finished. He writes political pamphlets for the Americans. He begins to study military handbooks. And later on, he wrote some of George Washington's speeches and proofread much of what George Washington wrote. He hated the mobs. He hated anarchy, which he saw around him at the beginning of the revolution. But he rises in the ranks at the age of 21. He's an artillery captain in charge of 70 men and a dozen cannons. He was a very good officer. He shared with his men. He even lent them money when they needed it, shares their conditions. As the war continues year after year, many other officers saw this young guy and offered, hey, come and work on my staff. Come and work as my aide. He turned them all down until George Washington asked him. When George Washington asked, he said, yes, I'd love to be